Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is Verity Seeker, and I'm your host, Mark Powles, and I have a very special guest here with me today. We have Matt Stevenson from Garnett, Kansas. And Matt, I appreciate you coming on the show today. Reason why this is special for me is because we're not strangers. We go back a long way, and I haven't really talked to you in a long time. We used to have these discussions where you teach. And before we get going on this interview about the Roman Catholic faith generally, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do for a living, education, whatever you want to tell us?
Yeah, for sure. And I appreciate you inviting me on. It took a little cajoling, but I appreciate it. And I remember, I think I first met you when I was a student, actually. You taught me in music. Yeah. And I vividly remember there was one year, I think it was the spring concert, you had kind of opened up to us and said, well, hey, what would you guys like to do? And I was really into Kansas at the time, classic rock band Kansas. And I kind of half jokingly, not expecting the response I got, said, well, how about we do Dust in the Wind? And you said, I like that. And so you put together like I think with a synthesizer maybe, you made a variation of Dust in the Wind, and we
little backup.
Yeah, so
I forgot about that. That was a lot of fun.
It was, yeah. So you and I go back quite a ways, and then we taught together at the same time then at the same school, and you used to come in early in the morning because you were not only teaching music and PE, you were also doing some of the maintenance on the building and whatnot, and I tend to come in pretty early, and you would be in there, and sometimes we'd get talking, and pretty soon school would be about to start, and I wouldn't have gotten any of my grading done or anything.
Boy, those discussions were very meaningful to me, because every time I went in there to do my custodial duty, I came out a lot smarter, and I appreciate that.
I don't know about that, but I always enjoyed that, because what I've always liked in discussing this stuff with you is that we have plenty of stuff that we see eye to eye on, and plenty of stuff that we don't. And you have always done a good job of making me think and being passionate in your pursuit of the truth. And so that makes for good dialogue.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think talking is one of the most important things that we need to continue doing as a society. If we stop talking, we'll never find the truth. The truth is out there somewhere, and we just have to keep looking for it and keep talking about it without anger.
Absolutely.
Yep. So what's you teach at St. Rose Philippine Duchesne Catholic School? It's French. Did I pronounce that right?
I've heard plenty of different pronunciations. I don't know that any of them are right, but that's the dominant pronunciation, at least here in Anderson County.
Yeah,
a French speaker might take issue with it, but that's the way we say it. So.
Okay, and now you have a family. I don't want to expose your family, but you're a family man, a father, and a husband. You want to say anything about that?
I married. Been married now for going on 6 years. 6 years, I think, in October. I know. So married 6 years. Have 3 little girls. My wife Nicole is awesome. I don't deserve her. Beyond supportive of me. This is the type of thing that she would never do, and is probably mortified that I am. But
oh gosh, does she even know about it, Matt?
She knows. Okay. She knows. She was supportive, but anyway. Well,
that's good. So actually, we do have a lot in common. You're surrounded by young ladies, and you're the only male in your family.
Yeah, and the only male on the staff at St. Rose, actually. So I spend a lot of time around the fairer sex.
The best, fairer, yes, absolutely. We
sure.
know how to handle these things.
Well, I wouldn't claim that, but...
Oh, that's great. Now, do you plan on staying over at St. Rose Philippine Duchesne? When you were there, it was a good gig, and the kids loved you, and they were learning things, like true history.
I'll say this, I absolutely love my job. Beyond content. St. Rose has a really good thing going on. At one point in time, not that long ago, we were enrollment was pretty low, and private schools, obviously, we operate in the free market, and if there's not a demand for our product, there's no guarantee that our doors stay open. We don't fall back on taxpayer dollars. So we were at a kind of dangerous level enrollment wise. I think in 2013 we had 40 students enrolled in a K through 8 building. And this last year, I think we were right up around 110. So we've seen pretty significant growth, and I think that's a testament to all of the awesome families that we have there. And like I said, really good thing going, and I genuinely enjoy going to work every day, and that's something that very few people can say. So
now we're going to get into the real business at hand. This is actually a Think Locally, Act Locally podcast series that I started a while back, but we really haven't heard from a practicing Roman Catholic, and there is no better person that I would like to have in here talking and having a discussion with than Matt Stevenson, who's a longtime friend and teaches in the Catholic school here in my hometown. And they must be doing something right over there, like you said, because the enrollment continues to rise in the Catholic school. So, and that's a very good thing. But we want to get strictly the Roman Catholic perspective, because I know there's a lot of people out there that have questions about it. Why pick on the Roman Catholic faith? I'm out with a lot of Protestants. I married a Mennonite, and of course, Mennonites have their perspective as well. Their traditions is what I should say. But people are, it seems like they're almost frightened of the Roman Catholic faith. There are so many misunderstandings. There's things they don't understand about it. And I'd like to open up with this main question, because it's the one question that Protestants ask. Why do we need a pope?
Well, firstly, I do want to preface anything else I say by saying that I won't pretend for a second to be any kind of an authority on Catholicism. Yeah. I'm probably not even the best person here in town to share this perspective, but to the best of my ability, I will share the Catholic perspective on these questions. If at any point I diverge from Orthodox Catholicism, it is purely out of my own ignorance or error. And so certainly not trying to spread any heresy here. In answer to your first question, are we supposed to have a pope? The answer is yes. So second question.
Okay, there you go.
That probably wanted a little. Did you want more than that? And actually, a probably more accurate answer from a Catholic would be that that question isn't for me. That question was for Christ, and he answered it 2,000 years ago. And it's really not up to me to answer. It doesn't matter whether I like that or not. That's the structure of the church that we were given. And as far as, the question that you get from a lot of Protestants is, well, where is that in the Bible, right? That's that Protestant principle of sola scriptura, right? If that can't be found in the Bible is the sole rule of faith. There's no authority outside of the Bible, or at the very least, that particular Protestant's interpretation of the Bible. And so as Catholics, we would say that that is not the case, right? That the church is built on twin pillars of authority. The tradition, capital T tradition, the teaching magisterium of the church, as well as the scriptures. And from the Catholic perspective, we would say that you can't get the scriptures without the tradition. The tradition produced the scriptures, because as we know, Jesus didn't write any of the books of the Bible. I'll clarify that. They were all divinely inspired. But Jesus himself in his earthly ministry wrote nothing down. We have one reference in the Gospels to Jesus writing, and that was, I believe, when they were stoning the adulterous woman, and he bent over and he wrote something in the sand, and I don't think we even know for sure what that was. Yep. So Jesus didn't write anything down. Nowhere in the Gospels does Jesus ask his followers to write anything down. He references multiple times a church that he is here to found, right? We hear him say things like, if there's disagreement between you, take it to the church. You have Matthew 16, which is by far the most well-known or most frequently cited biblical evidence for the papacy, right? Peter, you are the rock upon which I will build my church. So we see multiple references throughout the New Testament to Christ being here to establish a church, right? And as Catholics, again, this is the Catholic perspective. Protestants obviously would not agree with this, but the Catholic perspective is that Christ came to found a church, and that would be the tradition, capital T tradition, that he gave the authority to bind and loose and to teach to his apostles, and that over the course of the next several decades that they eventually chose to write certain things down, and that then over the course of the next few centuries, the teaching authority of the church, the tradition, produced the 27 book canon of the New Testament. And gave us the scriptures that, again, would be the second pillar that the church is founded upon. But as a Catholic, that's not usually our first line of thinking necessarily of, well, where is that in the Bible, right? Obviously, Catholics revere the Bible and respect it, right? It's one of the two pillars of the church. Our entire year, actually a 3-year cycle, is built around the scriptures, right? Every single day there are readings, and you work your way through 80% of the Bible in the 3-year cycle of the Roman Catholic liturgy, and all of the New Testament, most of the Old Testament. And so that's kind of the Catholic perspective on authority, because at the end of the day, that's the question, right? If you and I disagree about something, what's your authority, right? And you would ask me the same thing. Well, what's your authority for that? We see that when people say, well, what's your data? Where are your facts? What are your sources, right? That's an appeal to the authority with which you are speaking, right? And so Matthew chapter 16, again, because the Protestant perspective would be, well, where is that in the Bible then? And Matthew chapter 16 is by far the most commonly cited. I don't know if you're familiar with the passage.
I can't quote it.
Where Christ says, Peter, you're the rock upon which I'll build my church.
Oh, that one. Okay. Yeah.
And so I guess I would even maybe ask you what a Protestant, or how a Protestant would interpret that passage.
Well, actually, I've never heard anybody say how they interpret it. They do believe that Peter was the beginning of that process of establishing the church as an organized entity. Later passed on to Paul, and then he continued, going from community to establish churches, basically, starting or founding churches. I believe that's the Protestant perspective of that.
And I guess we should be careful when we say Protestant perspective, because Protestants are not a monolith.
Yeah.
And the answer would be different, from one denomination to the next. So I won't put you in a position of having to speak for all Protestants.
I don't want to get in trouble.
But I was just genuinely curious kind of what your perspective on that was.
Yeah, and I think they agree. The only thing that they don't agree with is how does the interpretation of, Peter, you're the rock, how does that translate into you are the Pope, the Pape, there's a disconnect there. They don't relate the two. And I think that's where there's a disconnect between the Roman Catholic, having the Pope and not having the Pope.
For sure. It's, they say that the best way to eat an elephant is one bite at a time. Beginning any kind of a dialogue with a Protestant, beginning that dialogue with the papacy is attempting to eat the entire elephant, right? Because if you as a Protestant suddenly became convinced on the Catholic doctrine of the papacy, well, then all the rest of it has to fall in line as well, right? If you believe in that magisterial authority that Christ entrusted to a particular entity, with the head of that entity being the Pope, well, then the rest falls in line, right? So in the grand scheme of things, this is actually probably the worst place to start any kind of a dialogue.
Whoops.
I've heard plenty of conversion stories from Protestants. I cannot think of a single person who said that it started with the papacy. I was just reading about the papacy, and I thought, I think the Catholics are right, because that would pretty much by default make you a Catholic, I think, right? Yeah. But the Catholic interpretation of that, and it starts with a question. Christ asks his apostles. First he says, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they give various different competing, even contradictory answers, right? They say, some say Elijah, some say John the Baptist, others Jeremiah, right? And Bishop Fulton Sheen has a great exegesis on this passage. He draws a parallel between, this is kind of the state of Christianity in the world today, right? Because when Jesus says, who do people say that the Son of Man is, obviously he's not talking about his detractors. He's talking about people who have heard his message and are intrigued by it, even in a remote sense, disciples to an extent, right? Because they're not saying, well, they say that you're Satan, or, they say, well, a lot of people think that you are Elijah, right? Because Elijah ascended to heaven. A lot of Jews thought that he would be coming back at some point. So these are people who are, in a roundabout way, disciples of Christ. And, Fulton Sheen would say that's kind of a parallel to modern-day Protestantism. A lot of people who are trying to follow these teachings, but who have different, even competing perspectives on this, right? And then Jesus says, well, who do you say that I am? Meaning the apostles there, right? And 11 of them are silent. Mm-hmm. And Fulton Sheen would say that that's a good analogy for the Orthodox Church, which, again, the Catholic perspective would be that the Orthodox Church has kind of been stuck in neutral since 1054, right? Without that teaching authority, it's hard for them to develop doctrine. There's disagreement amongst Orthodox churches upon how many ecumenical councils there are. Some would say 7, some say 8, some say 9. The Russian Orthodox Church is in pretty much complete schism right now, right?
Yeah.
So when he asks that, the 11 silent apostles, it's not that they don't have an answer. It's not that they've never thought about this, right? Mm-hmm. It's just that they don't feel that they have the authority to speak decisively about this, right? And so the one person who answers is Peter. And we would call this the Roman Catholic model, right?
Interesting.
Peter speaks on behalf of the 12, right? He says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says something interesting. He says, "Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you," right? The Father in heaven has revealed this to you. So we see this model of the church. Again, the Catholic perspective on this would be that that's the model of the church, right? Divine guidance, divinely inspired. Peter is the first pope, right? Speaking on behalf of the church, speaking authoritatively on behalf of the church. And then Christ goes on to say, well, he says a lot of things. He says, "Blessed are you." He calls him Simon Bar Jonah, right? Which Bar just means son of Jonah, which is really interesting because Jonah is not Peter's father, right? And there's a whole other thing. I won't get into it, but that's an allusion to the sign of Jonah. That's how Matthew starts his gospel, or early on in his gospel, he talks about this is a wicked generation. No sign will be given to you except for the sign of Jonah. And that can be a conversation for a different day. But then he goes on to say all of this that the Catholic Church would then interpret as the establishment of the papacy, right? He says, "I give to you the keys to the kingdom of heaven," which is a really weird thing to say, right? Like if you were to interpret that literally, it would be like Christ was preparing for his death and resurrection and ascension and just tidying up a couple of last things. And at the last minute, he's like, "Oh, gosh. And also, here, I got to give you these keys. These are to heaven. You're going to want these," right?
Yeah.
But he's not talking about literal keys, obviously, because, all of the Gospels are written for specific audiences. Matthew's Gospel is very clearly written for Jewish people who have not necessarily bought the whole bill of goods with Christianity and are still on the fence. So Matthew's Gospel quotes the Old Testament more than any. And so when he references a symbol, the best place to look for that is the Old Testament.
Yep.
And in the Old Testament, what were the keys to the kingdom? The keys to the kingdom were given to the steward of the kingdom while the king was away, so that he could act on behalf of the king, right? And so that is what the Catholic interpretation of that would be, right? He's giving these keys to the kingdom to the steward to act on his behalf authoritatively while he is gone, right? And then he goes on to say, "I give to you the power to bind and loose. Whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth is loosed in heaven," which is this idea of binding and loosing is rabbinical language, right? In the Jewish tradition, it would be the power to interpret doctrine, essentially, right? And so that's the Catholic Church's perspective on that. That's what everybody goes to.
And so the Pope is performing that duty to be the gatekeeper, the one, or the key master. Can I use that term?
Sure.
The key master. That's interesting. I'm glad you put it that way, and I'm going to have to think about that. And I think that's going to be good for our viewers too, the way you describe that. Now, which brings me to my next question then. Is it going to matter if you're part of a congregation that is non-denominational or a Protestant, where they don't rely on the Pope to hold the keys, to be the leader of the region or their particular faith? That's why we call it non-denominational. They don't belong to anybody. They're studying Scripture and practicing their Christianity directly through Christ. Because they do not have a Pope, and because they're not Catholic, if I may put it in quotations, are they kept out of the kingdom of heaven? Because I'm sure that might be another rub. And I just thought of that now. I'm not used to thinking that way. I'm just, with your explanation there, I'm thinking, so are these people in trouble?
So, the Catholic Church does not teach exclusive salvation. Does not teach that you have to be a formal member of the Catholic Church to attain salvation. The Catholic Church, the phrase that you will hear oftentimes is that the Catholic Church holds the fullness of truth. So Catholics believe that virtually all religions have some element of truth to them, right? And the closer that religion aligns doctrinally with Catholicism, the more truth that they would have, and that the Catholic Church has the fullness of truth. But simply being, formally a sacramentalized Catholic doesn't magically mean that you go to heaven. Plenty of Catholics go to hell. We have every reason to believe there are probably popes in hell. And likewise, not being, again, sacramentally, formally enrolled in the Catholic Church doesn't mean that you're excluded from salvation.
Okay. Why did the Roman Catholic faith rise above Orthodox Christianity in the West?
Well, it's interesting because, at the time of by the time of the Great Schism, East and West were very separated culturally already, and that goes back to around the time of Constantine. I think it might have been Constantine himself who actually split the Roman Empire into two halves, I guess, and they had...
and there's a lot of distance as well.
Yeah, quite a bit for sure. So, they culturally drifted apart, and really it was the invasion of the Muslims that kind of caused the Eastern Empire to, at least geographically speaking, to crumble to some extent.
Yeah. Why is it that the Roman Catholic faith became more predominant worldwide than the way I see the Orthodox Church?
Really, Christianity in general, but certainly Roman Catholicism was not a global phenomenon until the Age of Exploration, when these Western European world powers spread Christianity throughout the globe through colonization, would be, geopolitically speaking, how they, But what's interesting is the rise of the West in general. Mm-hmm. There's a really good book that I read recently called How the West Won by Rod Stark.
Yeah.
And he goes through kind of debunking a lot of these ideas that we have been told for a long time, right? Like if you think about the term the Dark Ages and the term the Enlightenment, and pretend that you had been raised by wolves, know nothing about society other than the English language, enough to understand those terms. And I just said, well, there's this one time period called the Dark Ages, and there's this other time period called the Enlightenment. Your knee-jerk reaction would be, well, obviously one of those things must have been really bad and the other one must have been really good. Like those are really, really loaded terms, right?
They sure are, yeah.
And the term the Dark Ages developed kind of as a pushback against religion, specifically Christianity, right? We have been taught that the Roman Empire was this great, magnificent achievement in the West, and that the Enlightenment was the next great cultural revolution, and everything in between that was terrible, right? And the reality is the Roman Empire accomplished, as far as, technologically speaking, well, technologically and culturally, they contributed two things to the West: concrete and Christianity. And the second of those two, they tried really hard to prevent from happening, right? And outside of that, technological innovation ground to a halt under the Roman Empire. They didn't need technology because they had slave labor, right? So the Archimedes screw was in use in many parts of the world at the time of the Roman Empire. We have every reason to believe that the Romans were actually aware of the Archimedes screw, right? That could be used to artificially raise water. And people look at these aqueducts that the Romans built and they say, wow, look how technologically advanced they were. No, it's because they couldn't use the technology that was available to them because they didn't need it because of slave labor, right? They were an empire that oppressed people, built on slavery. And technologically speaking, we see significant advancement after the collapse of the Roman Empire, right? Balkanization is always good for the free market, and not just the economy, but for technological innovation, right? And we see that on a large scale all throughout this period that we call the Dark Ages, right? There's not as nearly as much writing or literature has survived about this time period, which is part of the reason why you might think of this time as a dark age, because learning certainly wasn't as widespread or easily accessible, I guess, during the Roman Empire. But if you study the archaeology of it, it was a time of great advancement, right? The scientific revolution that supposedly took place in the Enlightenment, all of the seeds of that go back to the quote-unquote Dark Ages, right? Galileo actually just took the next logical step based upon the medieval scientists, many of whom were Catholic monks and priests. He kind of took the next step based on all of the research that they had already done. Yeah, but the whole concept of the Dark Ages came about well after the Dark Ages and is really kind of a pejorative term lobbed retroactively back at a time period that was very religious, very Catholic.
So it's almost slang for what happened, and it just got misinterpreted. Is that?
Well, I don't think it was misinterpreted. I mean, it was done very deliberately, to cast doubt upon the Christian worldview. But, things like the scientific method are born out of Christianity, the idea that the physical world is rational, that it's able to be interpreted, that there's a design behind it, right? Why did these things only arise in the West? Because of Christianity.
Yeah.
Right?
A lot of people ask, where did this word Catholic come from? I mean, did it just as a descriptive word? I mean, where does it? Is it Latin? Did it derive from the Latin language? Where did it come from?
I couldn't tell you what language it came out of. It means universal, right? So the Catholic Church is the universal church, and it really kind of falls back on this idea of the covenantal relationship. And Scott Hahn has a really good book called A Father Who Keeps His Promises.
I'm familiar with Scott Hahn.
And it traces the covenantal relationship from the time of Adam and Eve clear up to the modern day, right? And he draws it as, because again, the covenant is God's relationship to his chosen people, and it begins literally with a family unit, right? Adam and Eve, a husband and a wife. It expands to the extended family with Noah. It expands to an entire nation with Abraham. And then eventually the new covenant, the final covenant, the perfect covenant established by Christ is to go to the ends of the earth, right? To baptize all people. And that's where the term universal comes from, because, again, with the establishment of the new and final covenant, the perfect covenant that will exist until the end of time, the idea was this is no longer just for the nation of Israel. Go and preach to the Gentiles, right?
So those people who consider the Catholic Church some sort of a cult, they really don't understand the meaning of the word. Am I looking at that properly?
Yeah, I hear that a lot. Yeah, people say, well, why would you be Catholic? Why wouldn't you be Christian? Or, I'm not Catholic, I'm a Christian, with kind of the vague assertion that to be Catholic means that you're not a Christian. But, I mean, Catholic is just the term applied to the Roman Catholic denomination, right? Like Methodist. The term Methodist doesn't mean that you're not Christian.
Right.
That's just the name of that specific set of dogmas that are Methodist Christianity.
The meaning of the word universal, that has a mission title to it, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And so you'll see some Protestants will use the term, lowercase c Catholic, just meaning kind of the community of all Christian believers and stuff. But the Catholic Church, it's a bold claim, right? But all of the claims of the Catholic Church are pretty bold if you think about it. They capitalize it because they say the universal church, right?
Yeah, that's right. The one true church. That's what I remember.
That's the belief. So
yeah. Well, and for me, I believe that the goal is to become one church, one body, made of many, but one body, not disjunct, not broken apart, not fragmented. Because I think that's why we've struggled, why Christianity has been romped on throughout history so many times. It's almost been wiped out many times. And somehow we've managed to keep it together. But anyway, yeah, I just wondered about that, and I'm glad you touched on that. what is it that separates the Roman Catholic faith from other faiths? There is something. What is it? Like a Protestant church or non-denominational church as compared to the Catholic faith. Because they are different. There's something that divides them. And is it the Eucharist that divides them? Our way of thinking of the Eucharist. The communion.
I mean, the answer to that I feel would be different depending on what denomination you would be comparing Catholicism to.
Yeah.
The Eucharist is definitely a distinct one, but not unique to Catholics. I mean, my understanding is that all Orthodox Christian religions, or at least any that began prior to the Protestant Reformation, believe in the true presence. And a lot of the early Protestant reformers, at the very least, held a doctrine that was much closer to the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation than what you see in most Protestant denominations now. So that would certainly be a big one, but I mean, there are a lot.
So the difference is symbolism, remembrance during the communion compared to through faith when you're taking communion on the tongue, because you take it in the hand too nowadays, but it used to be that you could only take it on the tongue because it's been blessed, and it becomes the body and blood of Christ, the actual manifestation of the body and blood of Christ going into your body. Am I understanding that right?
I mean, yeah, more or less. That's the basic framework. So the term is transubstantiation, right? The transformation of the substance. And so there are two philosophical terms tied to this: the idea of essence and accidents.
Okay.
So philosophically speaking, the accidents of any particular thing are things that exist in one way, but could exist differently without changing the essence of what that thing is, right? So the essence is the core or true identity of what that thing is. And so prior to consecration, we would say that the accidents of the host are round, white, semi-firm, right? Mm-hmm. But as it exists as bread prior to that, those accidents could change and it would still be bread, right? In fact, most bread doesn't look very much like the host, right? So the accidents of the thing don't speak to its essence. That's why we call them accidents, because they could just as easily be different, and it wouldn't change the essence of what the thing is. Mm-hmm. And so after transubstantiation, we believe that the host becomes the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ under the guise of bread, right? The accidents of the thing don't change. It's still small, round, white, firm. But those things aren't what made it bread prior to consecration, and those things aren't what make it bread or would not make it the body of Christ afterwards. So there's a distinction between the essence and the accidents of a thing.
Okay. The taking of the communion. I think that's another rub for non-Roman Catholics, is that they're kept out of that if they don't believe the same way as a Roman Catholic, whereas, a Protestant will give communion to anyone. Everyone is welcome to the table. How do you reconcile that as a Roman Catholic?
Well, I would back up a little bit. It's not accurate to say that Catholics can receive the Eucharist. No one else can. Not all Catholics are able to receive the Eucharist. So the Eucharist is reserved for Catholics in a state of grace.
Okay.
Right? Paul tells us in the New Testament, he says, whoever eats and drinks of the body and blood without properly discerning eats and drinks judgment upon himself. And so that is done to protect Protestants, and not just Protestants, but Catholics who are not in a state of grace, from eating and drinking judgment upon themselves, right? And so the idea, we call it communion. And after you receive it, you say amen, which essentially means I believe. Yeah. And you do it publicly in front of the congregation. And so it wouldn't make sense, literally speaking, for someone who does not believe what the Catholic Church teaches to publicly stand up and say, I believe, right? And again, the idea is that we have a pretty stern warning from sacred scripture about that. So that's done to protect people, and not just Protestants, but Catholics who are not properly disposed.
Okay. Let's say a person who supports abortion and professes to be a Roman Catholic practicing Roman Catholic, can they be denied the body of Christ? Should they be denied the body of Christ because of their state of grace?
So, to the question of should they be, that's not a question that I can answer because I'm not in a position to make that judgment. To the question, could they be? The answer is yes. We've seen that happen. But, at the end of the day, it's a decision that has to be made by that priest. Ideally, it would be a priest who knows the person very well and has discussed these matters with them outside of, but I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, it's kind of a touchy subject with certain politicians,
absolutely,
public servants, and so we'll move on.
Yeah, like I said, I should have just stopped at the first one and answer to should they be. That's not for me to say.
Yeah, and that question was not planned. I don't,
Yeah, well, it's it's been in the news a lot lately.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of Catholics who. It's a hot button issue, I would say.
Definitely, yeah, definitely. And I'm not currently a practicing Catholic, and I have a problem with it because I do not take communion in a Catholic church because I understand the importance of it.
I guess I'll say this: there's no ambiguity in what the church teaches about abortion.
It's pretty straightforward.
And if you are to stand up publicly and demonstrate that you are in communion with the church and say, I believe. Like St. Paul said, you should be properly disposed. And so, but it's not my judgment to make, you know what I mean? I can't, I don't know the souls of these people, but
leave that one in God's hands, or the decision of the priest that's administering the body and blood of Christ. Well, okay. Now, is there anything else that you would like to bring to the forefront of this podcast that might settle some of the mysteries or the misunderstandings of the Roman Catholic tradition and faith?
Obviously
There's
that list would be really, really long. One other thing I would point to, I guess, because this is another huge stumbling block. I hear all the time in conversion stories, they say, gosh, I had read and studied, and I had decided that I believed the Catholic Church about everything except Mary. That is a huge stumbling block for Protestants. And again, I think that, because people try to make this connection to certain Catholic practices, a connection between that and paganism.
Yeah, right.
Which, there are certainly symbols that we borrowed from paganism. What we would call baptizing the pagan culture. Right, what Paul did in his speech at the Areopagus in the Acts of the Apostles, right? When he comes up here to speak, Christianity is starting to become a known theology, and they bring him to Greece to speak on this in this public forum and share the message of Christ.
Yeah.
As he's approaching the Areopagus, there's all these altars there to all of these gods, right? Mm-hmm. And he doesn't stand up and say, well, if you want to know what Christianity is about, destroy all of this, get rid of it, and start from scratch because this is all pagan, idolatry, etc. That's not his approach, right? He baptizes the pagan culture. He singles out one specific altar, and he says, that altar right there, labeled as the altar to the unknown God. He says, I'm going to preach to you about that God, right? So what he's saying is that impulse that you had right there, right? Kind of like the Catholic view of there's some degree of truth in almost every religion, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where you start. And so that's what was done at times with different pagan symbols and all of that good stuff. But not to get off topic there, the idea of Mary, people try to attribute this to paganism, and what they miss is, again, the connection to ancient Israel, right? Because Roman Catholicism spans this 1,500-year gap between the coming of the Messiah, right, and Protestantism. And so the world looked very different when the Protestant Reformation began than it did in the first century when Christ was alive. And so what the connection people miss out on with Mary is the connection to the ancient Davidic kingdom and the role that the Queen Mother played, right? That she could intercede on behalf of people. We see Bathsheba do this. People can take petitions to the Queen Mother because she has a special place in the kingdom and has the ear of the king, right? And then we see this play out in the New Testament, right? The first miracle that Jesus works is what?
Well, the water into wine.
The water into wine. And did that person go to Jesus?
Well, it was Mary.
They went to Mary.
Yeah.
And Mary interceded on their
Mary,
behalf
can you
to
tell your son to?
Yeah. So, that's, and we don't, again, and this was addressed, I think, in your previous one. Catholics don't worship Mary.
Yeah.
Right? We believe that Mary is a member of the church. The church exists in three phases: the church suffering, which would be, or not suffering, sorry, the church militant, right? Those of us here on earth. Mm-hmm. The church suffering, those in purgatory who are being purified for heaven, and then the church triumphant, those in heaven, right? But they're all members of the church. And just like I could ask a fellow Christian to pray for me, a fellow member of the church militant, the church struggling on earth, I can also ask a member of the church triumphant to intercede on my behalf.
Yeah.
And again, obviously, a Protestant theologian would take issue with all of that, but that's, that's the Catholic perspective, I guess. No, to the best of my ability to explain it, that's the Catholic perspective.
And I'm actually glad you brought that up, because it's another misinterpreted part or element of the Catholic faith. I've never had a problem with the Roman Catholic or the Orthodox perspective on Mary to intercede. And then you can get into the saints. You got these little things that fragment Christians in general, and I think we need to get past that. Is there anything else that you want to touch on?
Oh, I mean, like I said, the list would be long. There's nothing else I need to. We've been going for quite a while here. So if there's anything else you were...
Do you think your school, where you teach, do you think they're going to mask everyone up again with this whole new variant? Even though people who have taken the jab, what do you think's going to happen?
I honestly have no idea. I would be well beyond my purview to say what I think the archdiocese would or wouldn't do. I think what verb did you use there? Did you say mandate?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, that's really not what the archdiocese did the first time around.
They kind of let you decide.
I can't imagine that would be the case, but I don't know. I thank God I don't have to make those decisions, is all I would say.
Yeah. That concerns me a little bit with the public school and our private schools here. If they decide to go down that road again, I hope they don't. So I hope you don't do it. Well, Matt, I feel like we've covered Roman Catholicism pretty thoroughly, and it's because you are so concise and you've got it. I mean, you have the knowledge, and I appreciate it so much that you came in here and answered my questions and elaborated on all this confusion, really, that people have with the Roman Catholic traditions and practices.
To the best of my ability, like I said at the start, I won't pretend to be any kind of authority on the subject. There are certainly people here in Garnett that would do a much better job than I would or have, and I'm sure at the end of this I'll look back and find places where I misspoke or didn't word things as accurately as I should have. But to the best of my ability, that's my understanding of the Catholic perspective on the things that we have discussed.
Sure.
There's much more that we could, but you gotta break it off somewhere, right?
Yeah, you could turn this into a 7-part series, and you may still not cover every aspect of it. But if anybody out there has a comment, please fill in the gaps for us. I thought this was very good, and of course, like Matt said, we could spend hours getting into the details of it. But neither of us have that kind of time. We have things to do, and but if there's something that we missed, go ahead and fill in the gaps for us in the comments. But be nice if you can, and we'll try to address that. So Matt, thank you very much. I appreciate it so much.
I appreciate you giving me space on your platform to kind of share the Roman Catholic perspective on some of the stuff that you've covered recently. So very generous of you.
Well, no, it was my pleasure, and it helps the show find the truth. We're trying to get to the truth here, and I think I'm going to try to drag my family back to the Roman Catholic faith.
Well, hey, they're welcome. They'd be more than welcome, but I don't know.
I just said that. I don't know, but it is very convincing, and I do appreciate getting some of my ignorance filled up with some knowledge here. That really helped me a lot. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Verity Seeker, and we're going to sign off.